here to dig in. Our two reporters, NBC's Peter Alexander at the White House, MSNBC's Mariana Atencio in the southern part of Mexico near the border with Guatemala following that migrant caravan. Also from Austin, Texas, our analyst, Chris Wilson, Republican pollster who worked for the Ted Cruz campaigns, also worked for George W. Bush. Wendy Davis is a Democratic former state senator from Texas. She was the party's gubernatorial candidate 4 years ago. Peter, let me start with you there at the White House. Explain the strategy here.
Well, it's a good question. I guess I think Chris will have a sense of what Republican pollsters are seeing. But the bottom line is, concerned about complacency among his supporters. The president right now is trying to rile up his base, increasingly focusing on issues of immigration and race, as you noted, stoking fears and also delivering false and unsubstantiated claims. Voters we know are motivated when they are angry or afraid, not when they're content. And the president's trying to capitalize on that. Take this warning that there are unknown Middle Easterners, as he describes it, in this caravan. There is no evidence to support that. Just moments ago, Vice President Mike Pence told the Washington Post it's, quote, inconceivable that there aren't any Middle Easterners in the caravan. But we have reached out to the White House to present some of that evidence. They have not responded to our repeated requests. The president's allies say that he believes, however, these images, these shots of the caravan on TV help crystallize his argument over immigration, that it's politically potent for Republicans and damaging for Democrats. Here was the president last night.
Do you know how the caravan started? Does everybody know what this means? I think the Democrats had something to do with it, and now they're saying, I think we made a big mistake. Because people are seeing how bad it is, how pathetic it is, how bad our laws are.
So there are other examples beyond the caravan of the president either stretching the truth or just misrepresenting the facts. The president in recent days has claimed there is rioting in California over sanctuary cities. The White House hasn't provided any evidence to support that. The president said he would put in place a tax cut for middle-income Americans before November. That can't happen. Congress isn't even in session until after the midterms, and conversations I've had with people in and around the White House say they don't actually know what the president's referring to here. He argues that Republicans will always protect people with pre-existing conditions, but of course, they campaigned on and aggressively tried to repeal Obamacare, and in June, the Justice Department backed a lawsuit arguing that Obamacare and its provisions are unconstitutional. Those are all for starters. But, Craig, that's where we stand at the moment in the waning days. We're getting a sense of what the president's closing argument looks like.
Yes, we are indeed, Peter. Thank you. Chris, let's start with the migrant caravans here. How do you defend the president? There is, as Peter Alexander just pointed out, there is not one piece of evidence that Democrats started the migrant caravans.
Well, I think what the president's doing here is he's talking more about just the symbolism of it. And the fact is it is an issue that people care about.
No, he said they started the images.
It. Yeah, I can't speak to the specifics of where he's getting information from or what he may know that I don't know. I do know some of what he's saying came out with political leadership in Honduras. I mean, that's been well documented. Was a lot written about it. They were marching through there. Having said that, who started, who's funding it, who's paying for it, I don't have any specific information there, and I'm not going to second guess what the president's saying or not saying. I do think it is very bad optics for the Democrats right now as they're marching toward the border, and I don't think that's something I always often put myself in the place of a Democrat pollster whenever I'm dealing with these situations. What would I think if I were on the other side? And I don't see anything positive about this for them. So if there was something or there was some funding going on behind it, I got to think he's right in that they look at it now and think, this probably is not the best image for us as we get close to Election Day.
What do you know about these middle-class tax cuts?
What do I know about the middle-class tax cuts? Yeah. I know that middle-class people want more tax cuts.
But
they want more money in their
pocket.
pockets.
Are you talking to people who are saying that there's some sort of legislative item that we don't know about that might lead to middle-class tax cuts?
I do. I'm in Texas, Austin today, as you can see behind me. I always love being back here. And I do work, as you know, with Senator Cruz. He has been pushing for additional tax cuts, making the tax cuts permanent since the last set of tax cuts passed. And so is there legislation that exists? I mean, look, you know Washington as well as I do. There's always legislation that exists to do something. So there's more people filing bills up there than there are people around. But is there something that can be pushed through? Is there time to get it passed? Is there something that can happen? Yeah, anything's possible. I mean, I think we've proven that in the past. When Republicans and Democrats come together and recognize that the American people want a tax cut, more money in their pocket, less money being spent by the federal government, yes, you can get something done.
Wendy, the Washington Post has an entire article devoted to your party's struggle to answer. They write in part, quote, party leaders and Democratic candidates have largely been silent ahead of the midterm elections, refusing to engage with Trump. Where is the Democratic response? Why not engage with the president over some of these obvious falsehoods?
You know, I think Democrats are on their message, and they understand what has their voters motivated right now. They know that voters are motivated based on education, on local property taxes, as we are enduring the highest imaginable here in Texas, and trying to stay focused on turning out a group of voters who want to see the Trump agenda come to an end. That's what Democrats are continuing to try to message to their voters going into Election Day. And looking at the turnout here in Texas yesterday, it looks as though we are succeeding. We had record turnout in our urban areas here in Texas. Dallas County seeing over 300% increase from 2014. Dallas is a blue county. Bexar County, Harris County, Travis County. Every one of these deeply blue counties are counties that are seeing extraordinary high turnouts on the first day of early vote, and we expect to see that all the way through to Election Day. People are angry about the Trump agenda. They don't need any other reason to continue to be angry about it, and they're showing up and they're voting, showing that anger, and they're going to continue to do it, I think.
All right, I want to get down to Mexico now. MSNBC's Mariana Tencio. Chris, Wendy, stand by for me. Mariana Tencio is in Mexico. She's along this border. And I know that you have spoken to some people there in that migrant caravan. First of all, where are you? And help us fact check the president for us if you can there. Some of what he has been saying about who's behind this caravan, who's in this caravan. Walk us through some of that.
Craig, right now we are in Huixla. This is a city in the southern tip of Mexico. The migrants got here after a grueling 8-hour walk yesterday. Today is a day of rest. We have started to see signs of fatigue. You can sense that here with the Rodriguez family, who tells me that they really need a day to get medical attention, to get some food. And that is what is happening in the back over there. The local government here is actually supporting these migrants, welcoming them, and again, cheering them on their move north. But let's fact check the president for now. After walking with these people for more than 2 days, Craig, I've gotten a good sense of who they are. I have not seen any folks from the Middle East in this caravan. Most of the people are from Central America, namely Honduras. Why have they decided to march now? Folks like the Rodriguez family will tell you that it is fleeing poverty, gang violence, but also because of that contested presidential election in Honduras last November. The government of Juan Orlando Hernandez, they say, is repressive, and they fear going back. In terms of the criminal elements within this caravan, I have not seen any instances of criminality in my 2 days with them. None have been reported, Craig. Of course, when you're talking about a mass of 7,000 people, you can't vouch for everyone, but also I have seen no looting. And it says a lot when you're talking about 7,000 people, many of whom are starving, walking into these small towns. But also in terms of the political ramifications, the relationship between Mexico and the U.S., right now Mexico is not stopping them on their journey north. In fact, they are helping them. The president of Mexico saying he is asking them to get refugee status. Many of the migrants don't want to do that or don't have the documents to do that. When you ask many of them where they ultimately want to go, many will tell you the United States, but others are not opposed to staying in Mexico. But the takeaway is we're just at the very beginning of this journey, Craig. It can take them weeks to even reach the U.S. southern border. There's 2,500 miles between here and Tijuana, so a lot remains to be seen, and the signs of fatigue are definitely there. Craig?
All right, Mariana Tencio there in Mexico for us, Huixla, Mexico. I want to remind folks, Wendy, Chris, I want to remind folks some of what this president hasn't just said about this migrant caravan, but what he has said about undocumented immigrants in the past.
You know what you should do, John? Go into the middle of the caravan, take your cameras and search. Okay? Search. No. Take your camera, go into the middle and search. You're going to find MS-13, you're going to find Middle Eastern, you're going to find everything.
All right, so again, we did that, not what we found. Chris, demonizing these people, is that a message that has crossover appeal to swing voters?
You know, I think there is a difference in terms of how the definition, what you're saying is demonizing these people. Is there concern about 7,000 people marching toward our country to cross our border illegally? Yeah, there's absolutely concern about that.
That's not what the president's saying. The president's saying that there are MS-13 gang members in there, that there are people from the Middle East in there, and
your own correspondent said with 7,000 people, she can't vouch for every one of them. And then let's say, again, what I pointed out earlier is an important part of this. I mean, the whole saying that there's something that they're leaving because of the government. President Hernandez down in Honduras that was a fair election in which people voted democratically. I mean, let's be clear. This is not to leave one country and come to another without any sort of process. That they said they're not refugees. Right. There's not Honduras. They're not. I mean, yes, there's gang activity down there and it's unsafe. But the president of Hernandez is doing what he can to try and fix that, and to just try and leave the country and come into ours because it is a safer place or is a more economically feasible place. I think it says a lot about the United States right now. We should all be proud of that.
That's not what you're saying right now. The argument that you're making. That's not the argument that the president's making. That's not what he's saying at rallies. That's not the red meat that he's throwing to rile up his base. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that they're gang members, and he's saying that they're Middle Easterners in this caravan, and you and I both know why he's doing it. It's a dog whistle. It's loud. It's clear. It's plain. And it's worked time and time again, and it seems like it might be working now.
Again, your own correspondent said that out of 7,000 people, you can't vouch for every person that's in there. And if you want to say on national TV that there is absolutely no MS-13 members on there, I think that would be equally unclear. I mean, it's just we don't know who these people are one by one. And the fact is, for them to be able to enter the United States, I mean, all of us came here at some point. And to be able to enter the United States, there's a process that we go through. And I'll tell you this, I did at the beginning of this election cycle about 20 focus groups around the state of Texas. I sat down and talked to Hispanic voters. And I'll tell you, if you want to talk about a group that is upset and angry about illegal immigration, it is Hispanic voters, particularly those of Mexican origin, who came here legally and went through the process to do it the right way. And those are the ones who are going to be most upset about people coming into this country and just pouring over our border without going through it the right way and the way that they did.
Wendy, really quickly before I let you get out of here, Beto O'Rourke, he's raised a ton of money there in Texas. He hasn't led in any major poll. If Beto O'Rourke comes up short 2 weeks from now, what does the Democratic, what do you guys do with him? What happens to Beto O'Rourke?
You know, I think Beto O'Rourke is a rising star in the Democratic Party no matter what happens on Election Day. I do think he has a very good chance of winning this election based on the turnout that we're seeing, but also based on the fact that Beto has been appealing to two groups extraordinarily well. One of those groups are base voters who typically are not coming out in midterms and who already are showing up in droves. The other are suburban women who are turned off by the Trump agenda and who remember the family separations at the border, which I think is a message point that he's trying to turn them on right now through the fear-mongering that you were talking about a moment ago, Craig. But Beto is an extraordinary candidate. He, I think, really is poised to define what the future of the Democratic Party looks like. He has done a fabulous job of demonstrating what it looks like to be true to progressive values while bringing both parties together, while not putting partisanship above his principles and people. And this is a message that I'm seeing people respond to all over the state, including, as I said a moment ago, that very key segment voter, Republican suburban women.
Wendy, thank you. Rick, thank you as well, sir. Do appreciate your time. And thanks to Mariana Tencio there in Mexico.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.